I'm Eliza Bennett, 32, standing in my grandmother's mansion for our annual family conference, feeling like an alien among relatives dripping in designer labels and luxury watches. My simple blazer and modest jewelry draw condescending whispers and sideways glances despite sharing the same bloodline. 10 years of their mockery about my financial struggles while I silently built my empire. Little do they know what's in my briefcase today. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stick around to see how I finally showed my status-obsessed family what real wealth looks like. My family, the Bennetts, have been fixtures in Boston real estate since the 1920s, when my great-grandfather turned a small inheritance into a budding empire during the post-war boom. By the time my grandmother Elizabeth took over in the 1970s, the Bennett name was synonymous with luxury properties across New England. Unlike her brothers who focused on flash and status, Grandma Elizabeth was a shrewd businesswoman who believed wealth should be quiet and purposeful. My father, her youngest son, inherited her pragmatic approach. He fell in love with my mother, a kindergarten teacher with no family money, causing quite the scandal among the status-conscious Bennetts. They chose a modest life in a small suburb, much to the family's dismay. Dad worked as an architect, designing homes he believed people would actually love living in rather than status symbols, while Mom continued teaching. They taught me that money was a tool, not a personality trait. When I was 15, they died in a car accident coming home from a weekend trip, and my world collapsed overnight. Grandma Elizabeth took me in while my aunts and uncles whispered that I'd become the charity case of the family. In those first painful months, I'd often find Grandma in her study late at night, looking through old photo albums or reviewing property portfolios. "Eliza," she would say, "most of the family has forgotten what wealth is actually for. They think it's about showing off, but real wealth is invisible. It's security, opportunity, and the power to affect change." During the 3 years I lived with her before college, she taught me more about finance, investment, and property valuation than any course ever could. She showed me how to read market trends, identify undervalued properties, and most importantly, how to be patient. My cousins, Brad, Victoria, Taylor, Jessica, and Blake, grew up very differently. Uncle Richard, who took over as family patriarch after Grandpa died, believed in conspicuous consumption. His children, and those of my other aunts and uncles, received sports cars for their 16th birthdays, took luxury vacations every school break, and wore only designer clothes. Meanwhile, I drove the used Toyota my parents had left me, worked part-time jobs, and invested every penny I could spare. Grandma Elizabeth passed away during my senior year of college, leaving each grandchild a modest inheritance, while my cousins used theirs for down payments on luxury condos, exotic vacations, or even more ridiculous. Blake bought a small yacht he barely uses. I followed my grandmother's advice. I lived simply in a small apartment, continued working, and strategically invested my inheritance in small, overlooked properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. The annual family conference began as Grandma Elizabeth's way of ensuring family unity and shared purpose. After her death, Uncle Richard transformed it into a display of status competition, who had the most impressive portfolio update, who had acquired the most expensive possessions, which cousin had the most impressive career trajectory. Every year, I would show up in my modest clothes, share my deliberately understated updates, and endure their thinly veiled pity. What none of them knew was that by my 28th birthday, my portfolio had grown to include 12 residential properties and 3 small commercial buildings, all purchased through anonymous LLCs with the guidance of Grandma's old lawyer, Mr. Winters. Last year, I learned that the sprawling apartment complex where Uncle Richard's daughter Victoria, my cousin Blake, and 3 other family members lived had gone on the market. The owner was retiring and looking for a quiet sale to avoid alarming tenants. Using a holding company structure Mr. Winters helped establish, I purchased the building for $28 million, nearly every cent of my available capital. I implemented subtle improvements while keeping my ownership completely anonymous, even raising rent slightly, though well below market rate. And now, as I prepared for this year's conference, I received word that Uncle Richard planned to propose selling Grandma's mansion, the heart of our family legacy and the last physical connection to her wisdom. The same mansion where I'm now, standing, watching my family flaunt their wealth, completely unaware that the poor relation they've mocked for years owns the very roof over many of their heads. I pulled up to Grandma's mansion on Friday afternoon in my 10-year-old Toyota, the same car I'd been driving since college. The circular driveway already gleamed with luxury vehicles. Brad's new Maserati parked prominently near the front steps. Aunt Catherine's Mercedes SUV, Uncle Richard's Bentley, and various other high-end cars that probably cost more than most people's houses. I parked between Blake's Range Rover and Victoria's BMW, my Toyota looking like it had accidentally wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed down my simple navy blazer from Banana Republic and checked my minimal makeup in the rearview mirror. The mansion looked exactly as it always had. 3 stories of elegant brick Georgian architecture, with white columns flanking the entrance and perfectly manicured gardens stretching across 4 acres. Walking up the limestone steps, I felt a familiar blend of warmth and apprehension. This place had been my sanctuary after losing my parents, but now it represented the widening gulf between my life choices and those of my relatives. I'd arrived purposely early, hoping to soak in some peaceful memories before the full family circus descended. Martha, the housekeeper who had served our family for over 30 years, opened the door before I could even ring the bell. "Miss Eliza," she beamed, pulling me into a warm hug that smelled of lemon furniture polish and cinnamon. "So wonderful to see you. You look more like your grandmother every year." I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "Thanks, Martha. You're still the best welcome committee this place has." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You might want to know that Mr. Richard has been here since morning, rearranging the conference schedule and meeting with the family attorney." This wasn't surprising, but confirmed my suspicions about the mansion sale. Martha helped me carry my weekend bag to my old room, the one I'd lived in during those formative years with Grandma. Unlike the other guest rooms that had been redecorated multiple times, this one remained largely unchanged. The same pale blue walls, white furniture, and window seat overlooking the rose garden that Grandma had loved so much. I ran my fingers over the bookshelf still holding my old favorites, finance textbooks mingling with novels, the notebook where Grandma had taught me to track stock movements, and the small framed photo of my parents and me at Cape Cod the summer before they died. I was unpacking when a knock came at the door. My cousin Jessica stood there, the only family member who'd ever shown me consistent kindness. "Thought I heard you arrive," she smiled, leaning against the doorframe. Unlike our other cousins, Jessica had built her own career as a pediatrician, though she still maintained the expected level of family luxury. She wore designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my entire outfit, but her eyes held none of the judgment I usually faced. "I wanted to warn you before everyone shows up. Uncle Richard has big plans this weekend. He's going to propose selling the mansion." Though I'd suspected this, hearing it confirmed made my stomach sink. "But this place is our heritage. Grandma would never have wanted that." Jessica sighed, coming to sit beside me on the bed. "I know. But he's talking about unlocking the property value and modernizing family assets. He's already got most of the votes lined up." Votes. The Bennett family governance structure was another of Uncle Richard's innovations after Grandma passed. Family decisions were weighted by one's contribution to the overall family holdings, meaning Richard, as the most commercially successful, effectively controlled most decisions. My small declared holdings gave me minimal voting power. "Is that why we're meeting for 3 days instead of the usual 2? I asked. Jessica nodded. "Property discussions Saturday, financial reviews Sunday, and the big vote Monday. He's bringing in developers to present concepts for luxury condos where the mansion would be." My heart sank. This place wasn't just a building. It was the last physical connection to Grandma's wisdom and values. The thought of it being demolished for yet more high-end real estate felt almost sacrilegious. "I'm going to fight this," I said quietly. Jessica squeezed my hand. "I know, and I'll back you. But be prepared for resistance." She glanced at her watch. "Everyone's gathering for dinner in 20 minutes. Victoria's already asked twice if the poor cousin has arrived yet." I forced a smile. Wouldn't want to disappoint her. After Jessica left, I took a moment to center myself. I'd come to this conference with a plan, but now the stakes felt even higher. Dinner that evening was exactly as expected. Crystal glasses, fine china, and conversation designed to highlight everyone's latest achievements. Uncle Richard held court at the head of the table where Grandma used to sit, talking about his latest development project. Completely sold out before construction even finished, he boasted, swirling his 30-year-old scotch. We had to turn away buyers. Aunt Catherine chimed in about her charity gala that had raised more than last year's by $100,000, while pointedly noting that she hadn't seen Eliza's name on any philanthropic donor lists lately. My cousin Brad, now an executive at Uncle Richard's company solely due to nepotism, kept directing the conversation toward his new Maserati. The waiting list was 9 months, but they expedited for our family name, he smirked, glancing at me. What are you driving these days, Eliza? Still that Toyota? I took a sip of water. Still serving me perfectly well. Uncle Richard's wife Patricia made a sympathetic clicking sound. You know, dear, if you'd just let Richard mentor you in some property investments, you could afford to upgrade your lifestyle a bit. I bit back the urge to inform her that my property investments were doing just fine without Richard's mentoring. Instead, I simply smiled. I'm comfortable with my choices. The subtle digs continued throughout dinner, references to exclusive clubs I didn't belong to, comparisons of vacation homes I didn't own, discussions of private school options for cousins' children that I couldn't afford if I had kids. Despite it all, I maintained my hope that once they understood the full picture, there might be a path to genuine family connection. After dinner, I walked the grounds alone, visiting Grandma's rose garden now illuminated by soft landscape lighting. Standing there among her carefully cultivated flowers, I resolved again to preserve her legacy, both the physical mansion and the values she'd instilled in me. Whatever happened this weekend, I would find a way to honor her memory, even if it meant finally revealing what I'd been building all these years in the shadows. Saturday morning arrived with golden autumn sunshine streaming through the curtains of my childhood bedroom. I dressed carefully in black slacks and a simple blue blouse, professional but not showy. The main family conference would begin at 9 in the grand drawing room, where generations of Bennetts had made decisions that shaped our family fortune. Entering the room, I immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. The usual family portraits had been removed from the walls, replaced with architectural renderings of modern condominiums. Uncle Richard stood at the front beside a digital projector, while my cousins and their spouses filled the antique chairs arranged in a semicircle. Several faces I didn't recognize sat in the back row, presumably the developers Jessica had mentioned. "Ah, Eliza, good of you to join us," Uncle Richard announced as I slipped into a seat beside Jessica. We were just about to begin our discussion on family image and standards. I nodded politely, noticing how several cousins exchanged glances when I sat down. Richard launched into his presentation, clicking through slides that showed the Bennett Family Holdings logo, emblazoned on increasingly luxurious buildings. "Image is currency in our world," he proclaimed, pacing in his Italian leather shoes. That probably cost more than my monthly rent. The Bennett name opens doors, but only if we maintain certain standards in how we present ourselves to the world. His gaze lingered meaningfully on me for a moment before continuing. After discussing several development projects already in progress, he advanced to a slide labeled Family Residence Reassessment. My heart sank as a beautifully photographed image of Grandma's mansion appeared on screen. As you all know, this property has been in our family for 4 generations. While it holds sentimental value, it's sitting on 5 acres of prime real estate currently valued at approximately $45 million. Aunt Victoria, elegant in her designer suit with perfectly highlighted hair, raised her manicured hand. "Richard, before you continue, I think we should acknowledge that some family members might be emotionally attached to the old house." She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eliza, dear, I know you lived here for a time and we all respect that, but surely you understand that sentimentality can't stand in the way of sound financial decisions?" Before I could respond, my cousin Blake jumped in. "Speaking of sound, financial decisions, has anyone seen my new SL Roadster outside? Just picked it up yesterday. Limited edition, only 20 in North America." The not-so-subtle topic change was clearly designed to emphasize the gap between my financial status and theirs. Very nice, Richard nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of statement piece that reinforces our family's position in the community. He then continued with his presentation, outlining a plan to sell the mansion, divide the proceeds among family shareholders, weighted by current holdings naturally, and develop luxury condominiums on the property. The developers in the back row began distributing glossy brochures showing renderings of glass and steel structures, bearing no resemblance to the warm brick home that had sheltered generations of our family. The projected return on investment is substantial, Richard concluded triumphantly. Any questions before we move to preliminary voting? I raised my hand, and Richard acknowledged me with barely concealed impatience. I think we should consider Grandma Elizabeth's wishes, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. She specifically wanted this house preserved as our family gathering place and historical anchor. She told me many times that not everything should be measured by its potential return on investment. Uncle Richard's smile tightened. While Elizabeth had many admirable qualities, the market has changed considerably since her time. What made sense then doesn't necessarily make sense now. Aunt Catherine tittered. Besides, Eliza, with your limited experience in high value real estate, perhaps this isn't an area where your input carries much weight, I persisted. I've analyzed the property values and neighborhood trends. This location's historic value actually increases its worth as a preserved property, rather than being demolished for yet another luxury development that might sit half-empty like the Westbrook project did last year. The room fell silent for a moment before Brad gave a short, dismissive laugh. Analysis? What would you know about real estate? You can't even afford a house of your own. You're still renting that little apartment downtown, aren't you? Several cousins snickered, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. My housing choices are deliberate, not limitations, I replied, but Brad talked over me. Sure they are. Just like my choice to drive a $150,000 car instead of a 10-year-old Toyota is deliberate. Some of us can afford our choices, cousin. Others just pretend their limitations are choices. Richard cleared his throat, not to defend me, but to move the discussion along. Let's take a preliminary vote on the concept of selling and redeveloping. We can address specific proposals after lunch. The vote was exactly as Jessica had predicted, overwhelmingly in favor of selling, with only Jessica and me opposed. As we broke for lunch, I felt a crushing weight of disappointment. It wasn't just about losing the house, it was the realization that my family truly saw me as nothing more than the poor relation, someone whose opinion had no value because her bank account didn't impress them. Jessica found me in the garden during lunch, sitting on the stone bench where Grandma used to tell me stories about our family's history. I'm sorry, she said, sitting beside me. They can be such snobs. I nodded, fighting back tears. It's not even about the money. They've never bothered to ask what I actually do with my life or why I make the choices I make. They just assume I'm struggling and failing to keep up. Jessica squeezed my hand. For what it's worth, I've always admired how you've charted your own path. There's something admirable about not needing to show off all the time. I smiled gratefully, but the morning's confrontation had left a deeper wound than I'd expected. All these years, I told myself that my family's opinion didn't matter, that I was building something meaningful regardless of their approval. But their casual cruelty and dismissal still hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. As we walked back toward the house, Jessica lowered her voice. Just so you know, tomorrow's session will be worse. Everyone has to present their personal financial highlights for the year. Richard always structures it to emphasize who's contributing most to the family prestige. I nodded, already dreading it. Thanks for the warning. That evening at dinner, the conversation revolved around which luxury amenities should be included in the new condominium development that would replace our family home. As I listened to them debate between infinity pools or private rooftop gardens, between marble or imported limestone finishes, I realized how fundamentally different our values had become. While I sat silently contemplating the growing divide between my family and me, I couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be a bridge across it, or if I even wanted there to be one anymore. Sunday morning's session focused on inheritance matters and property holdings, the meat of our annual family conference. The drawing room had been rearranged overnight with a long mahogany table replacing yesterday's casual seating arrangement. Uncle Richard took his position at the head, with leather portfolios placed at each setting. Mine, I couldn't help noticing, was thinner than everyone else's. "Today we'll review our individual and collective holdings," Richard announced after everyone was seated. "As you know, our family voting structure is weighted by contribution to overall assets. I've taken the liberty of preparing an updated assessment." He nodded to his assistant, who distributed spreadsheets showing each family member's declared assets and their corresponding voting power. As expected, Richard himself controlled 38% of the votes, with his children and siblings holding most of the remainder. My own voting share was listed at a mere 2%, reflecting only the small inheritance from Grandma that I'd publicly acknowledged, plus my modest salary as a financial consultant, my deliberately vague job title. "Before we begin individual presentations," Richard continued, "I'd like to propose some adjustments to the distribution framework established in Elizabeth's will." This caught my attention immediately. Grandma's will had included some protection mechanisms to prevent any single family member from gaining too much control. Richard was now suggesting streamlining these protections for administrative efficiency. The proposed changes would effectively consolidate more power with the wealthiest family members, particularly himself. As family members nodded along, I carefully noted each suggested modification. These would be crucial details to discuss with Mr. Winters later. After the inheritance discussion, we moved to individual financial updates. Brad went first, proudly describing his new position as vice president in Uncle Richard's company, the bonuses he'd received, and his portfolio of luxury investments. "And of course, there's the new vacation property in Aspen," he concluded smugly. "Closed on it last month, 4 bedrooms, ski-in, ski-out access, and a hot tub overlooking the mountains." Next came Blake, boasting about his tech startup investments and the yacht he'd upgraded because the last one just wasn't quite big enough for proper entertaining. Victoria detailed her expanded art collection and the private school where she'd secured spots for her children, despite the 5-year waiting list. They made an exception for the Bennett name, of course. One by one, my relatives outlined their expanding wealth and status symbols, each presentation met with appreciative nods and follow-up questions. When Taylor mentioned struggling to find household staff for her 3 homes, Aunt Catherine immediately offered contacts for the best agency for domestic help. They only work with certain families, but I'll put in a word. The conversation eventually turned to the luxury apartment complex where several family members lived, the very building I secretly owned. "The amenities are top-notch," Victoria commented, "but the management has been making some changes I don't particularly care for. They've been renovating the lobby, disrupting everyone with construction noise." Blake nodded vigorously. "And they raised the rent last quarter. Not significantly, but still, on principle. Who do they think they are?" Brad leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You know what's strange? No one seems to know who actually owns the building now. It was purchased by some holding company last year. Very mysterious." Uncle Richard tapped his pen thoughtfully against his portfolio. "Perhaps we should leverage some family connections to find out who's behind the purchase. If it's some investment group, they might be persuaded to sell to us instead. The location is prime, and having control would benefit those of you living there." I maintained a neutral expression, though my heart raced at how casually they discussed, using their influence to pressure the mystery owner, me, into selling against my wishes. "We could apply some pressure through the right channels," Richard continued. "I know people at the city planning office who could make approvals for their future renovations challenging." The casual way they discussed using their connections to essentially bully a property owner made my blood boil. This was exactly the kind of entitled behavior Grandma had always criticized, using family power not to create value but to take it from others. When my turn finally came late in the afternoon, I presented a deliberately understated summary of my consulting work and modest investment growth. As I spoke, I noticed Brad checking his phone, Victoria whispering to her husband, and Uncle Richard impatiently tapping his pen. No one asked follow-up questions or showed any interest in my careful financial strategy. Instead, Aunt Catherine seized the first pause to ask, "Dear, have you considered a career change? Surely there must be something more substantial you could pursue with the Bennett name behind you." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Before I could respond, Brad interjected with a smirk. Maybe she just needs to marry well. That's still a valid strategy, right? The room filled with poorly concealed laughter. I felt my cheeks burning but kept my expression composed. I'm quite satisfied with my current path, I replied evenly. Not everyone measures success by the same metrics. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Well, speaking of different metrics, I think we should discuss a special provision for family members who might need additional support. He didn't look directly at me, but everyone knew who he meant. The Bennett family has always taken care of its own, and perhaps we should formalize a structure for those who haven't been as fortunate in their financial endeavors. The humiliation of being discussed as a charity case was almost unbearable. I sat rigidly in my chair, hands clasped tightly under the table, as they debated how to help me without actually consulting me about what I might need or want. Later that evening, I escaped to my room and called Mr. Winters, my trusted attorney and advisor. They're planning to change Grandma's will provisions, I explained, detailing the proposed modifications. And they're talking about investigating the ownership of Victoria's building. Mr. Winters chuckled softly. I anticipated something like this. Don't worry, your ownership structure is completely secure and anonymous. Multiple corporate layers protect your identity. I sighed, looking out the window at the garden now silvered by moonlight. It's not just about keeping my investments secret anymore. They're planning to sell Grandma's house, the heart of her legacy, and the way they talk about using family connections to pressure people, to bend rules in their favor, it's everything. She despised. Elizabeth would be proud of how you've honored her real values, Mr. Winters said gently. What do you want to do now? I thought for a long moment, watching a cloud pass over the moon. I think it's time to prepare my full portfolio documentation. Can you courier over the complete ownership records for all properties, including the apartment complex? Are you sure? He asked cautiously. Once you reveal your holdings, there's no going back. I'm sure, I replied, newfound determination replacing the hurt I'd felt earlier. They've underestimated me for the last time. Tomorrow I'll show them exactly who they've been dismissing all these years. Monday morning dawned with a sense of foreboding as I prepared for the final day of our family conference. Today, each family member would present their detailed financial statements and investment strategies, the portion of our annual gathering that had always been designed to highlight the gap between my relatives' extravagant wealth and my supposedly modest means. I dressed more carefully than usual, choosing a simple but elegant black dress I'd purchased on sale at Nordstrom last year, paired with my mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I ever wore to these events. The family had gathered in the library by the time I arrived, the antique table now covered with laptops, tablets, and expensive leather portfolios embossed with the Bennett family crest. Uncle Richard began by reiterating the importance of maintaining family standards and introduced a new element to our usual proceedings, a comparison chart showing each family member's net worth growth over the past 5 years. The bar graph he displayed on the projector screen showed his own towering achievement in navy blue, followed by substantial columns for his children and siblings. My own contribution appeared as a barely visible sliver at the far end of the chart. As you can see, he said with a thin smile in my direction, some of us have embraced the Bennett legacy of financial acumen more successfully than others. Several family members chuckled, and I noticed Brad nudging Victoria as they both glanced at me with poorly disguised amusement. The individual presentations began with Uncle Richard himself, who detailed his expanding commercial real estate empire, recent acquisitions in emerging markets, and plans for developing a luxury hotel chain. My cousins followed with equally impressive displays: Brad's executive compensation package, Victoria's husband's hedge fund successes, Blake's tech investments that had apparently doubled in value. Each presentation received thoughtful questions, appreciative murmurs, and suggestions for further growth opportunities. When my turn came, the energy in the room visibly deflated. Several relatives reached for their phones, while others began quiet side conversations. I began my prepared summary of modest consulting projects and small investments, keeping to the script I'd maintained for years. Uncle Richard checked his watch repeatedly, making it clear he considered this a formality not worth his full attention. Halfway through my presentation, Aunt Catherine interrupted with a heavy sigh. Eliza, dear, I don't mean to be unkind, but it's painful watching you live so far below your potential year after year. The Bennett name should count for something, yet you seem determined to, well, struggle. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. I kept my expression neutral. I wouldn't characterize my life as struggling, Aunt Catherine. I'm quite comfortable with my choices. Brad snorted. Comfortable? In that tiny apartment with your secondhand furniture and 10-year-old car? Let's be honest. You're the poor relation? We all know it. More laughter rippled through the room, less restrained now. Some of us, Brad continued, warming to his topic, are actually building on the family legacy. Others are just coasting on the minimum Grandma left them. The casual cruelty hit harder than I expected. Despite years of their condescension, being openly mocked still cut deeply. Uncle Richard cleared his throat, not to defend me, but to move things along. Perhaps this is a good time to discuss the family assistance program I mentioned yesterday. Eliza, there's no shame in accepting help when needed. We could establish a monthly stipend to help you maintain a more appropriate lifestyle for someone with our family name. The suggestion that I needed their charity, when I was worth more than several of them combined, was the final straw. But I maintained my composure, years of practice hiding my true feelings serving me well. That won't be necessary, Uncle Richard, but thank you for your concern, I said evenly, gathering my notes. If my presentation is concluded, I'll step out for some air before lunch. As soon as the library door closed behind me, I rushed upstairs to my room, hands trembling with a mixture of rage and hurt. Alone, I finally allowed the tears to fall, not from financial insecurity, but from the painful recognition that my family had never truly seen me. They'd created a narrative about who I was without ever bothering to look beyond their assumptions. I moved to the window seat where Grandma and I used to sit together, looking out over the garden she'd loved so much. "What would you do now?" I whispered, as if she might somehow answer. In the quiet of the room, surrounded by memories of the one family member who had truly valued me, I felt a shift inside, a hardening resolve replacing the raw hurt. This mansion, this legacy, was as much mine as theirs, and I had honored it in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Martha, the housekeeper, entered with a concerned expression. "Miss Eliza, I brought you some tea. I noticed you left the meeting rather quickly." Her kind gesture brought fresh tears to my eyes. Martha had been with the family for decades, and unlike my relatives, she had always treated me with genuine warmth. "They still see me as that orphaned teenager who needed charity?" I said, accepting the teacup with a grateful smile. "No matter what I do, I'll always be the poor relation to them." Martha sat beside me, her weathered hands smoothing her apron, a gesture I remembered from childhood when she was gathering her thoughts. "Your grandmother used to say that wealth makes some people's vision very poor," she said quietly. "They can only see what shines brightest right in front of them, not what holds true value." She paused, then added, "Miss Elizabeth would be so proud of how you've honored her teachings. She always said you were the only one who really understood what the Bennett legacy should mean." Hearing this validation from someone who had known my grandmother intimately provided unexpected comfort. "Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know." She patted my hand before standing. "The package you were expecting arrived while you were in the meeting. I put it on your desk." My heart leaped. Mr. Winters had sent the documentation I requested. "Thank you," I said again with renewed purpose. After Martha left, I opened the courier package and spread the contents across my bed. Property deeds, corporate ownership structures, portfolio valuations, and most importantly, the documentation proving my ownership of the luxury apartment complex where Victoria, Blake, and 3 other family members currently lived. I traced my finger over the title deed with its official seal, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Tomorrow, I had planned to reveal my true financial position, but after today's humiliation, I questioned whether I even wanted these people in my life anymore. Did I really need the validation of family members who had shown me nothing but condescension and casual cruelty? As I gathered the documents, Memories flooded back. Grandma teaching me to read financial statements at this very desk, explaining that true wealth wasn't about displaying status, but creating security and opportunity. The Bennett name used to mean something more than showing off, she told me once. It meant integrity, foresight, and using privilege responsibly. In that moment, looking at the evidence of how faithfully I'd followed her guidance, I made my decision. I wasn't going to reveal my success to win their approval or respect. I would do it to honor Grandma's true legacy and to establish once and for all that I wasn't merely a footnote in the Bennett family story. I was its future, whether they recognized it or not. The afternoon session began with renewed energy as Uncle Richard shifted the discussion to addressing concerns about tenant relations in the luxury apartment complex, where Victoria, Blake, and several other family members resided. The irony wasn't lost on me as I took my seat, documents tucked securely in my portfolio, listening to my family complain about property management decisions I had personally approved. The new security system installation has been incredibly disruptive, Victoria complained, tossing her perfectly highlighted hair. The contractors start at 9 in the morning. 9! As if anyone should have to hear construction noises during breakfast. Blake nodded vigorously. And they've implemented this new guest registration policy that's completely unnecessary. I had to actually register my housekeeper as a recurring visitor. Do they not understand who we are? Richard leaned forward, steepling his fingers in the authoritative gesture he'd adopted after Grandma's passing. This is exactly why family control of key properties is essential. When buildings change hands, new management doesn't understand the needs of prestigious tenants. I bit my tongue as they continued, knowing that the security upgrades had been implemented after a break-in 2 floors below Victoria's unit, and the guest policy followed multiple complaints from other residents about unidentified people accessing amenity areas. My improvements had actually increased the building's value by 12% in the past year, though of course they saw only the minor inconveniences. I've had Jenkins look into the ownership structure, Richard continued, referring to his personal attorney. The building was purchased by Horizon Holdings last year, which is owned by Summit Investments, which appears to be controlled by some offshore entity, deliberately obscure, which suggests they might be vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. The calculated way he discussed leveraging family connections to essentially bully the owner, me, made something snap inside. Still, I maintained my calm exterior, years of practice serving me well. What kind of pressure? I asked innocently. Richard smiled, not noticing the dangerous edge in my voice. There are always approval processes that can be expedited or delayed, depending on relationships with the right officials. Plus, with 5 Bennett family members as tenants, we represent a significant portion of their premium units. A coordinated approach could make continued ownership uncomfortable for them. Brad chuckled. Not to mention if we found code violations or tax irregularities, our friends at the city assessor's office might suddenly become very interested in auditing their properties. I watched in disbelief as my family casually discussed using their influence to essentially harass a property owner into selling against their will, a textbook example of the entitled behavior Grandma had always criticized. And Eliza, Bradia, added with a smirk, turning to me. This is how real estate actually works in the real world. Not that you'd understand, since you can't even afford your own place. Still renting that tiny apartment downtown, right? The room fell silent for a moment before uncomfortable laughter broke out. It wasn't just the mockery that infuriated me. It was the casual corruption they embraced while claiming to uphold the Bennett legacy. Speaking of real estate, Richard smoothly transitioned, let's finalize our decision about this property. He gestured around at the mansion. The developers have presented an excellent offer, and the projected returns from converting to luxury condominiums would benefit all shareholders. I raised my hand, determined to make one last attempt at preserving Grandma's home. Before we vote, I'd like to propose an alternative. This house has historical value beyond its real estate potential. What if we converted it into a Bennett Family Foundation headquarters? We could preserve the architecture while creating something that honors Grandma's legacy of community investment. Richard's expression made it clear he'd already dismissed the idea before I'd finished speaking. While that's a creative suggestion, the financial return would be minimal compared to development. We have to be practical about these assets. Aunt Catherine nodded. Besides, a foundation would require considerable ongoing management. Some of us, she glanced meaningfully at me, might have time for such projects, but those of us actively growing the family fortune have other priorities. The vote that followed was a formality, with Richard controlling nearly 40% and his allies another 45%, my 2% and Jessica's 5% made no difference. The decision to sell Grandma's beloved home and replace it with luxury condominiums passed with overwhelming support. As Richard outlined the timeline for vacating the property and beginning demolition, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about the soul of our family and the values that had been abandoned in pursuit of status and material display. Later that evening, I called Mr. Winters from the privacy of my room. They voted to sell the mansion, I told him, looking out at the garden where Grandma had taught me about patient investing and true value. And they're planning to use family connections to pressure the mystery owner of Victoria's building into selling. Mr. Winters chuckled softly. They have no idea who they're dealing with, do they? Are you still planning to reveal yourself? Tomorrow? I watched the sunset painting Grandma's roses in shades of gold and crimson. Yes, but I need your help with something else first. Can you prepare documents transferring my ownership of Bennett Capital Holdings to a new entity, one that would allow me to purchase this property before they can sell to developers? There was a pause before he replied. Elizabeth always said, "You are the one who truly understood the meaning of legacy. I'll have everything ready for the morning. What name do you want for the new entity?" I smiled, remembering Grandma's favorite quote about wealth being a tool, not a trophy. Call it Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. After ending the call, I spent hours reviewing the complete documentation of my holdings, preparing for the revelation that would forever change my relationship with my family. The hurt and anger I'd felt earlier had crystallized into something more powerful. Absolute clarity about who I was and what I stood for. Whether they accepted me or not no longer mattered. I was a Bennett in the ways that truly counted, and tomorrow they would finally understand exactly what that meant. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I spread all my portfolio documents across the bed, organizing them meticulously for tomorrow's revelation. The complete picture was impressive even to me. Property deeds, corporate ownership structures, investment accounts, and financial statements showing a net worth that would shock my status-obsessed family. 15 properties in total, including 3 commercial buildings in rapidly developing areas, 12 residential properties in prime locations, and of course, the luxury apartment complex where several family members lived. My total assets exceeded $73 million, more than Brad, Blake, and Victoria combined. I organized everything into a leather portfolio I'd purchased specifically for this moment, one that matched the expensive ones my cousins carried to family meetings. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the first time I'd ever spent money on appearance rather than substance, but tomorrow was about making a statement they couldn't ignore. As I worked, memories flooded back of Grandma sitting with me in this very room, teaching me her philosophy of patient wealth building. The problem with showing off your money, Eliza, she'd said, is that you're always spending instead of growing. True wealth isn't about displaying status, it's about creating security and opportunity. I remembered how she'd taught me to analyze neighborhood development patterns, to identify properties with long-term appreciation potential rather than immediate prestige value. While my cousins were buying luxury condos in already established neighborhoods, I'd followed Grandma's advice to look for overlooked areas on the cusp of revitalization. My first purchase had been a small duplex in a neighborhood that other investors had dismissed as transitional. I'd lived in one unit and rented out the other, using the income to offset my mortgage while property values steadily climbed. 2 years later, I sold it for nearly double my investment and rolled the profits into 2 more properties, continuing the pattern of living simply while my portfolio expanded. The apartment complex had been my biggest gamble, investing nearly every liquid asset I had into a single property. But the location was unbeatable, and my analysis showed strong appreciation potential with relatively minor upgrades. Using the LLC structures Mr. Winters had helped establish, I'd maintained complete anonymity as the owner, implementing improvements that increased both value and tenant satisfaction, despite what my complaining cousins might believe. I pulled out the original handwritten investment journal Grandma had given me when I turned 18. The first entry, in my teenage handwriting, detailed the $500 I'd invested in a mutual fund she'd recommended. Page after page chronicled my journey, first small stock purchases, then increasingly sophisticated investment decisions, all following her principles of patience, research, and value over flash. I traced my finger over her annotations in the margins. Excellent analysis, Eliza, and consider the 10-year potential, not the 2-year return. These notes had guided me when she was no longer here to advise me directly. My phone chimed, with a message from Mr. Winters. All documents prepared as requested. Elizabeth's Legacy Trust established. Ready to proceed at your signal tomorrow. I texted back my thanks, then continued organizing my portfolio, making sure every document was arranged for maximum impact. This wasn't just about revealing my financial success. It was about honoring Grandma's true legacy of thoughtful stewardship and quiet strength. Around midnight, a soft knock at my door surprised me. Jessica stood in the hallway, concern evident in her expression. Just checking if you're okay. You were quiet at dinner. I hesitated before stepping aside to let her in, quickly gathering the documents spread across my bed. Her eyes widened as she glimpsed the property deeds and financial statements. Eliza, what is all this? I trusted Jessica more than anyone else in the family, but I'd kept my secret for too long to reveal it casually now. Just preparing for tomorrow, I said vaguely. She picked up a folder I'd missed, the one containing documentation of my ownership of the luxury apartment complex where she, along with Victoria and Blake, lived. Her jaw dropped as she read the title deed. You? You're the mysterious owner they've been complaining about? I nodded, relief washing over me at finally sharing my secret with someone who might understand. Please don't tell them yet. I'm planning to reveal everything tomorrow. Jessica sank onto the window seat, shaking her head in disbelief. All these years, they've been treating you like the struggling poor relation, and you've been… What? A secret millionaire? I smiled at her astonishment. I followed Grandma's advice about patient investing and living below my means. The less they noticed me, the more freely I could operate without family interference. Jessica laughed softly. Brad is going to have a heart attack. He was just saying tonight that someone should explain basic real estate principles to you so you could at least afford a decent car. Her expression turned serious. Are you sure you want to do this? Once they know, everything will change. They'll either resent you or suddenly become your best friends. Neither option is particularly appealing. I joined her on the window seat, looking out at the moonlit garden. I don't need their approval anymore, but I do need to honor Grandma's legacy, the real legacy, not the distorted version Uncle Richard has created. I explained my plan to purchase the mansion through Elizabeth's Legacy Trust before Richard could sell it to developers. Jessica squeezed my hand. She would be so proud of you. I'll be right beside you tomorrow. After she left, I laid out what I would wear for the final confrontation. A simple but perfectly tailored charcoal suit I'd purchased from a boutique in New York last year, but had saved for a special occasion. Nothing flashy or designer labeled, but quietly elegant in a way that reflected my actual values, rather than the family's obsession with obvious status symbols. I also selected my grandmother's simple pearl necklace, the one piece of family jewelry I'd inherited and the perfect symbol of her belief in understated elegance. As I finally prepared for bed, I felt strangely calm. Tomorrow would change everything, but I was ready. The frightened, insecure orphan who had once accepted their condescension was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built something substantial. By honoring the true Bennett values, not of displaying wealth, but of creating it thoughtfully and using it purposefully. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would face it knowing that the person who had truly understood what the Bennett legacy should mean would be standing with me in spirit. Watch me tomorrow, Grandma, I whispered to the moonlit room. I think you'll be proud. Tuesday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed fitting for the day of reckoning. I dressed with deliberate care in my tailored charcoal suit, fastening Grandma's pearl necklace and adding pearl studs that had belonged to my mother. Looking in the mirror, I saw not the poor relation my family had dismissed for years, but a woman of substance and purpose. For the first time, I applied a touch of red lipstick, not to impress them, but as war paint for the battle ahead. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early, placing my leather portfolio precisely at my usual seat, and then stepping out to the hallway to center myself. When I returned at exactly 9 o'clock, the family had assembled in their usual formation. Uncle Richard at the head of the table, surrounded by his inner circle of sycophants, with those of lesser standing arranged in descending order of perceived importance. Jessica caught my eye and gave a subtle nod of encouragement. "Good. We're all here," Richard began, not bothering to acknowledge my arrival. "Today we'll finalize the mansion sale arrangements and discuss the apartment. Complex situation." He gestured to his assistant to distribute folders containing what appeared to be developer contracts. The Westbrook Development Group has offered $48 million for the property, with construction to begin next month. Their legal team has prepared the preliminary agreements for all shareholders to sign today. As folders circulated around the table, I remained perfectly still, watching the family's excited murmurs as they reviewed the substantial payouts they would receive. Based on the current shareholding structure, Uncle Richard stood to gain nearly $18 million from the sale, while my 2% share would yield less than $1 million. Still significant money, but a fraction of what the others would receive. Now, Richard continued, regarding the apartment complex matter, Jenkins has identified some potential leverage points with the mysterious owner. We've drafted a letter from the family attorney suggesting certain code compliance reviews might be forthcoming, unless they're willing to discuss a reasonable offer. The casualness with which he described what amounted to legal harassment made my blood boil, but I maintained my composed expression. "Before we move forward with either of these items," I said, my voice stronger and more confident than it had ever been in a family meeting, "I'd like to request the floor for a brief presentation of my own." Richard checked his watch impatiently. "We have a tight schedule today, Eliza. The developers are expecting our signed agreements by noon." "This won't take long," I replied, standing and moving to the front of the room without waiting for his permission. The unusual assertiveness of my movement caused several cousins to exchange surprised glances. I opened my portfolio and removed a single document, the most recent valuation of my complete holdings. "For years, I've listened to assumptions about my financial situation," I began, making eye contact with each family member in turn. "I've heard the whispers about the poor relation and endured the condescension, the pity, and occasionally the outright mockery." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Victoria suddenly became very interested in her manicure. "Yesterday, Uncle Richard presented a graph showing each family member's contribution to our collective wealth. I think it's time to update that data." I handed the valuation summary to Richard's assistant, instructing her to display it on the projector. As the document appeared on screen, showing my net worth of $73 million, a stunned silence fell over the room. "This can't be right," Brad finally sputtered, his face flushing red. "There must be some mistake." I smiled coolly. "No mistake. While you've been buying sports cars and vacation homes, I've been building a real estate portfolio that outperforms most of yours combined." I began distributing copies of my complete financial statement, enjoying the shocked expressions as family members flipped through pages detailing my extensive holdings. "But you live in that small apartment?" Aunt Catherine protested weakly. "You drive that old Toyota?" "By choice," I replied, "not necessity. Grandma taught me that displaying wealth and building wealth are often opposing goals. I chose to focus on the latter." Uncle Richard had turned an interesting shade of gray as he scrutinized my financial documents. "How did you manage this, without family connections, without our network?" The genuine bewilderment in his voice almost made me laugh. "I used the principles Grandma taught me about patient investing and identifying undervalued properties with growth potential. The same principles this family seems to have abandoned in favor of flashy developments and status-driven acquisitions." I removed another document from my portfolio, this one showing my ownership of the luxury apartment complex. "And regarding the mysterious owner you were planning to pressure and harass," I continued, walking around to place the document directly in front of Victoria, "I believe you're all my tenants." The room erupted in chaos. Blake knocked over his water glass. Brad began sputtering incoherent denials, and Victoria stared at the document as if it might bite her. Uncle Richard attempted to regain control, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. This is impossible. You couldn't possibly have acquired that building. The purchase price was well over $20 million. I smiled, enjoying his discomfort. $28 million, actually. All legally and ethically acquired through careful investment growth over 10 years. I turned to address my cousins directly. So, when you complained about construction noise during breakfast, Victoria, you were complaining about security upgrades I ordered after the break-in on the 12th floor. And Blake, that unnecessary guest registration policy came after 3 separate incidents of unauthorized people accessing the gym and pool areas. Their expressions of shock would have been comical under different circumstances. Uncle Richard was rapidly flipping through my financial statements, his brow furrowed. Even if this is all true, it doesn't change the family voting structure regarding the mansion sale. The agreements have been prepared based on the established shareholding percentages. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I placed one final document on the table, the incorporation papers for Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. Actually, there's been a recent change in ownership structure. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I've transferred all my holdings to Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, which has simultaneously purchased Jenkins Development Company. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Jenkins Development Company, as you might recall, owns 30% of Bennett family holdings, acquired slowly over the years through various proxy purchases. The color drained completely from Richard's face as he finally understood the magnitude of what had happened. That's not possible, he whispered. We would have known. Would you? I asked quietly. You were all so convinced of my financial insignificance that no one bothered to notice what I was actually doing all these years. I turned to the entire family, speaking with a calm authority that silenced even Brad's sputtering. With my newly consolidated voting shares, I now control 35% of Bennett family holdings. Not quite a majority, but enough to block any major decision, including the sale of this mansion. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usually unflappable Richard seemed at a loss for words. Finally, Jessica broke the tension with a slow, appreciative clap. Well played, cousin. Grandma would be proud. Brad, never one to accept defeat gracefully, pushed back from the table. This is some kind of trick. You can't just swoop in and take control after contributing nothing to the family business for years. I fixed him with a steady gaze. I haven't taken control, Brad. I've prevented the dismantling of Grandma's legacy by people who've forgotten what that legacy truly means. I gathered my documents and returned to my seat, letting them process the seismic shift that had just occurred. The mansion sale is off the table, I stated flatly. As for the apartment complex, rest assured I have no plans to evict family members, though I will be reviewing the significant rent discounts some of you have been receiving compared to other tenants. Victoria's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, possibly both. Uncle Richard, ever the strategist, was already recalibrating. His expression shifted from shock to a calculating assessment of how to adapt to this new reality. Perhaps we should discuss a more collaborative approach to family holdings going forward, he suggested, his tone notably more respectful than it had been just minutes ago. I think that's wise, I agreed. Starting with a review of Grandma's original vision for the family legacy. 1. Based on stewardship rather than status, on growing wealth thoughtfully rather than displaying it ostentatiously. As I looked around at their stunned faces, I felt not triumph, but a quiet satisfaction that finally, after all these years, they were seeing me, truly seeing me for the first time. In the days following my revelation, the Bennett family dynamics underwent a seismic shift that no one could have predicted. The immediate aftermath in that conference room was a blend of chaos and desperate recalibration, Uncle Richard attempting to salvage his authority, Brad alternating between disbelief and clumsy attempts to reframe our relationship, Victoria suddenly discovering a deep respect for my business acumen that had apparently been invisible to her for decades. The transformation was both fascinating and transparent. Richard was the first to adjust, inviting me to a private lunch, the very next day at his exclusive club where he'd never once suggested I join him before. I've clearly underestimated you, he admitted, studying me with new eyes across the white tablecloth. Perhaps we've all been blinded by traditional expectations of success. I sipped my water, neither accepting nor rejecting his olive branch. Grandma would say we've confused the substance of wealth with its symbols. He nodded thoughtfully. Elizabeth always did have a different perspective than most of the family. I see now she passed that to you. His attempt at reconciliation was predictable but came with strings attached, proposals for joining forces, and leveraging our combined influence that revealed he still hadn't grasped the fundamental difference in our values. I listened politely but made no commitments, explaining that any future collaboration would need to align with the principles of responsible stewardship that Grandma had championed. Aunt Catherine attempted a different approach, inviting me to her country club for tea and suddenly expressing interest in my philanthropic vision, after years of dismissing my charitable contributions as insignificant. The strain of pretending she hadn't spent years condescending to me showed in the tight corners of her smile. Family is so important, don't you think? Despite our little differences through the years? She suggested, patting my hand in a maternal gesture that would have been touching if it weren't so calculating. Brad took longer to approach me, his pride clearly wounded by the revelation that his supposedly struggling cousin was substantially wealthier than him. When he finally called, it was with a business proposal, a development project he claimed needed my unique perspective. Though it was transparent, he was primarily interested in access to my capital. I declined politely but firmly, suggesting he revisit some of Grandma's investment principles if he wanted to discuss future collaborations. Not everyone's reaction was self-serving. Jessica, who had stood by me during the revelation, remained a steadfast ally in the family reconfiguration that followed. It's like watching a nature documentary, she joked over coffee a week after the confrontation. Observe as the Bennett family members adapt to the new apex predator in their natural habitat. We laughed together, the genuine warmth of our connection standing in stark contrast to the suddenly solicitous attention from relatives who had previously dismissed me. I made conscious decisions about which relationships to nurture and which to maintain at a polite distance. Those who showed genuine remorse for their previous treatment earned second chances. Those who merely adjusted their behavior without real introspection received professional courtesy, but little more. The future of Grandma's mansion became my first major project. Rather than selling to developers as Richard had planned, I established it as the headquarters for the newly formed Elizabeth Bennett Foundation, dedicated to affordable housing initiatives and financial education for underserved communities. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very family members who had mocked my supposed financial limitations would now attend foundation events in a building preserved by the wealth they hadn't known I possessed. I maintained my modest apartment and reliable Toyota, not out of necessity but continued choice. The freedom of living unburdened by others' expectations had become too valuable to abandon, even now that my financial reality was known. My cousins still occasionally expressed bewilderment at my preference for substance over display, but they no longer dared to mistake it for inability. The most meaningful consequence of my revelation came 6 months later, when Martha, our family's longtime housekeeper, approached me at a foundation event hosted at the mansion. "Your grandmother visits me sometimes in my dreams," she confided, her weathered hand resting on mine. Last night, she was positively glowing with pride. She said, "Martha, she understood all along what the others forgot, that wealth is meant to provide security for doing good, not for showing off." Tears pricked my eyes as Martha continued. "Miss Elizabeth always said you were the one who truly inherited the Bennett spirit, not the name or the money, but the heart of it." That validation meant more than all the newfound respect from family members who had dismissed me for years. My healing journey wasn't instantaneous. The hurt of decades of condescension and exclusion couldn't be erased by a single moment of triumph. There were still family gatherings where old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, still moments when a careless comment from Brad or Victoria would reopen old wounds. But with each passing month, I grew more comfortable in my new role as a guardian of Grandma's true legacy, finding a balance between forgiveness and maintaining healthy boundaries. The greatest lesson I learned through this journey wasn't about money at all. It was about authenticity. For years, I'd allowed my family to misperceive me, partly out of strategy, but also partly out of a lingering desire for their approval. The freedom that came with finally being fully seen, whether they liked what they saw or not, was more valuable than any property in my portfolio. I discovered that success without integrity becomes hollow, that wealth without purpose becomes a burden, and that family connections without genuine respect aren't worth maintaining. Today, as I sit in Grandma's rose garden, now preserved in perpetuity through the foundation, I feel a sense of peace that transcends the vindication of that dramatic revelation day. The Bennett family continues to evolve, some relationships healing into something authentic, others maintaining a respectful distance. The mansion that was nearly sold for condominiums now hosts financial literacy programs for young people from backgrounds similar to my mother's, the kindergarten teacher who married into wealth but never forgot the value of work and character. I still drive my Toyota to foundation meetings where Uncle Richard arrives in his Bentley, but the difference now is that we both understand it's my choice rather than my limitation. The true wealth I've built isn't just in my real estate portfolio. It's in the freedom to live authentically regardless of others' opinions, to honor values that matter beyond status and display, and to use privilege as a tool for positive impact, rather than personal aggrandizement. So what about you? Have you ever been underestimated by family or friends only to prove them wrong later? Or maybe you're still in that building phase where others don't yet see your potential? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey of quiet determination and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength and authenticity, even when others don't see your worth. Thank you for joining me today. And remember, sometimes the most powerful move isn't displaying your advantages, but waiting for the perfect moment to reveal them.